Hey, hello, class, and welcome back to History 200. I'm Professor Santangelo. I'm still your host, and I'm still down here trapped in the basement. Welcome to Coronavirus 2.0. This is the first of two lectures that is going to be for Thursday, March 26th. You'll recall that the last couple of lectures, which are pretty long, and let me let you in on a little bit of a secret. I almost never get through that stuff on the first night, so it's weird for me to be doing these things for Thursday. Probably some of them would have been held over for later. But anyway, nice to be on schedule. You recall that those previous lectures we talked about how this part of the world began slowly to come into contact with the other parts of the world after being isolated for centuries, millennia, um, and how that really picked up after Columbus's voyages. Although Columbus, of course, was not the first European that we can definitely know about who had come here. Certainly, Leif Erikson had been here earlier. After Columbus, who was working for the Spanish, stumbled across these continents that no one in Europe knew existed before, then the Spanish eventually, through dumb luck and also with the assistance of the germs they brought with them, the horses and the guns, and just a great desire for land and plunder, eventually defeated the Aztecs, the Incas, and developed one of the largest empires in the history of the world, powerful and rich, and became the first Europeans to settle explore and then settle in what is going to be now the United States of America. We heard a little bit about the French and the Dutch as well, but now we're going to pick up the story with the English, because the English colonies are going to be the basis for what will someday be the United States of America, which is kind of what our class is about. So here we go. Let's pick up the story in the mid 1500s. At that time, England was a very small, rinky dink little island nation off the northwest corner of Europe. No one really in their right minds would have guessed that England was going to be such a dominant power in Europe and in the world. The most important leader in England in the mid 1500s was King Henry VIII, of whom we'll hear more later in a different context next week. Henry VIII recognized that his country, which was pretty weak, economically not very strong, was looking for some support from one of the stronger countries in Europe. And so in the 1500s, Henry VIII entered into an alliance with Spain. Part of that deal was that the Spanish agreed to help out the English, but in exchange, the English agreed to give up, renounce all of their rights to any colonies in the New World. You'll recall that they had hired that Italian dude, Giovanni Caboto, whose name they pronounced John Cabot because Italian is too confusing for them. Um, so the English worked sort of underneath as a second tier power and were helped out by the Spanish, and that was fine because economically they were nowhere near thinking about anything as complicated or as expensive as colony making. Really, in the 1500s, the English economy was that they were on the fringes of Europe. They provided some of the raw materials for English industry or for European industry. If you had money in England in the 1500s and you wanted to invest it, you would invest it in sheep because that was really what the English did. They harvested sheep, they sheared the sheep, and then that went over to Flanders and other parts of Northern Europe, which got turned into clothes. Well, this bottom fell out of the sheep market in the 1500s. Not long after that, Henry VIII passed away, and it's very complicated. English history, which thank goodness for our purposes we don't need to know too much about. English history was very complicated chain of succession. This is the last and latest of a long, complicated set of internal disagreements and, in some cases, wars. But anyway, when the dust settles, the new leader of England is Henry's daughter, Elizabeth, the first queen that England had had, first female leader. Elizabeth never married, so she's Elizabeth the First. I happen to know that there's going to someday be an Elizabeth the Second, who is still queen, and as far as I can tell, will be queen forever. But anyway, Elizabeth the First, who took the throne in 1558, she had a very different vision for England than really any of the other monarchs of England had before. After consolidating power in the country, her goal really was to make England a major force in European affairs. She was a nationalist. She wanted to make England much stronger than it had previously been, and if the internal problems are resolved, which they're not entirely resolved, but they hoped that they would be, and if their religious issues are resolved, and we'll hear more about English religion in a lecture next week, but if those things had been resolved to the satisfaction of enough people in the country, then they could start to look outward. For that to be the case, though, then England had to come out from under the shadow of Spanish control because, as I said, they'd entered into alliance with the Spanish, where the Spanish really bossed them around. So, under Elizabeth, the English began to pull away from the Spanish in ways that irritated the Spanish and would eventually lead to a major conflict with the Spanish. Part of this meant that Elizabeth sponsored or at least encouraged voyages of exploration in the areas that previously the English claimed was theirs in North America. They're looking for other ways to get around North America and to dominate the trade with Asia. But again, that was not possible, but it led to some maps and things like that that they could then use later. A lot of what Elizabeth was doing with relations to North America in those days related to something called privateering. So if you've seen the Johnny Depp movies where he's a pirate, you have an idea of what this is like, except a pirate is a sailor who runs a ship where they work for themselves. Everyone's out to get them, but they're out to get everybody else. They have no real allies, and they just sort of take stuff. And if they succeed, then they get the wealth that they take, and then they sort of go and they try to spend it on their own. Well, a privateer is sort of similar, but slightly different. A privateer is kind of like a pirate, except they work for or have the authority given to them by a monarch or by a government to attack the ships of one specific or maybe a set of other countries. Privateering was a very big industry for the English in the 1570s and 1580s under Queen Elizabeth as the English tried to become a little bit more powerful, a little bit more economically strong, and as they also tried to pull away from Spanish control. So the privateers, which were very successful, the English privateers of the 1570s and 1580s, their job essentially was to attack Spanish ships that were coming back from the New World laden down with all sorts of goodies, gold, silver, and other precious metals, and various other things that were of value. This was sort of legal. Privateering is, from the English point of view, is legal, and from the sort of international law, doesn't really exist the way it does today. Not sure you could get away with this now, but certainly the English did their best to get away with it at the time. The way this works is that you, as a privateer, instead of flying your own flag or the Jolly Roger, that flag that Johnny Depp has, which is the classic pirate flag, rather than flying that flag, you're flying the English flag, which indicates that you're working for the English. Although you're not actually part of the Navy or anything like that, instead, the government has helped pay for your expedition in exchange for a promise of receiving a percentage of the proceeds. So if the privateers are successful on their mission to go and attack Spanish ships and maybe knock one off and steal some of their gold or whatever, when the privateers get back to England, they will share some of those profits with the monarch, in this case, the Queen. Queen Elizabeth was pretty cheap. This was a cheap way for her to gain power, but also wealth, because she didn't really have to lay out that much. The real risks are being taken by these privateers, but if they're successful, which they frequently were in this period, then she is going to gain more wealth and also begin to show herself against the Spanish, with whom they're becoming significant rivals. So, two of the privateers in particular worth noting are a couple of half brothers named Humphrey Gilbert and Walter Raleigh. And these guys, I mean, there's not much that distinguishes them from pirates. They're essentially attacking ships in the high seas. They're using violence to get what they want. These are tough characters. But because of the success of the privateering missions, ultimately, Queen Elizabeth knighted both of them. So Humphrey Gilbert became Sir Humphrey Gilbert, and Walter Raleigh became Sir Walter Raleigh. And just imagine in those Johnny Depp movies if he was someday Sir Jack Sparrow. That clearly was not going to be the case because he's just a pirate. But these privateers are helping out Elizabeth a lot, and at various times or others, people referred to them as some of Elizabeth's royal favorites. As I said, she's the Virgin Queen. She never married, but she could do whatever she wanted. She's the queen. So the privateering expeditions helped England enormously because England was weak and small, and any profit that it received from these privateering missions was to its benefit. For the Spanish point of view, the English privateers were an annoyance that they wanted to get rid of, but were in no way a true game changer. And I would say in many ways the privateers are similar to the kinds of bugs or mosquitoes that might annoy you if you're out sitting around or walking around on a warm summer night. Um, you're, in this case, you're Spain. You're this incredibly powerful, rich Spanish Empire that is doing well and is going to be doing just fine. And the mosquitoes that are flooding around you and you're trying to bat away, the mosquitoes are like the English privateers. Every now and then one of them lands on you. Every now and then one of them may suck a little blood and get away before you can actually swat it. And from the point of view of the mosquito, that's a successful mission, and that mosquito is going to be fat, rich, and happy compared to the other mosquitoes, but is still minuscule and not life changing for you, the host, because you're just going to sort of say, well, that was annoying. But eventually, if enough mosquitoes land on you, you're going to do something about it, whether that's get the mosquito repellent or something more drastic. And so eventually, the greater and greater success that the English privateers were having was definitely going to lead to some sort of a bigger conflict between the Spanish and the English. And Elizabeth was taking a risky dare here because the English were much weaker than the Spanish, but in the meantime, it worked out to her benefit. Now, these privateering missions also got the English more interested in the New World because at the beginning, their missions were based out of England. And England, of course, is nowhere near the New World, nowhere near the Western Hemisphere, and certainly nowhere near the ultimate source of the wealth of the Spanish Empire, which is what they're trying to get at. It's not near Mexico and the gold mines there. It's not near Peru and the silver and copper mines there. It's not near the Spanish holdings in the West Indies, where there are big plantations that are producing valuable products that would then be sold by the Spanish throughout Europe. England's nowhere near that. And so for them to launch voyages to attack ships coming from that part of the world from England, it's not very efficient. And so over time, as you get into the later 1570s and as privateering picks up as a big industry for the English, um, it seemed logical, therefore, that the English should try to establish bases of operation to support the privateers closer to where their actual adventures would be. So that led to one of the first reasons, and there are other reasons as well, but one of the launching points for English colonization in any real systematic way in the New World is largely due to the privateering efforts. Now, as I said, Elizabeth is pretty cheap. She doesn't want to spend any of her own money. She doesn't have a lot of money compared to a lot of the other monarchs of Europe, and she's on the cheap anyway. So Elizabeth recognized that setting up these bases would be good for her and good for the privateers, and so she made the privateers do it. At the time, in the late 1570s, specifically 1578, the most important of the privateers at the point, her biggest royal favorite, I guess, was Humphrey Gilbert. And so in 1578, she gave him the responsibility to set up a colony in the New World that would be part of the English Empire, or be under the control and part of the land that is part of English property, I guess. But it'd be run by Walter or Sir Humphrey Gilbert, and it would be paid for by him. Similar to the way the privateering was mostly the responsibility of the individual privateers, setting up this colony is the responsibility of in this case the big privateer Humphrey Gilbert. Uh, Sir Humphrey Gilbert asked Queen Elizabeth for a little economic support because he was doing this for her as much as for him, and she wasn't really forthcoming. Instead, she gave him a document circling an area on the map and said, "You can have anywhere in here. I give that to you, but that's only worth something if the privateer, in this case Humphrey Gilbert, was successful." So Humphrey Gilbert in 1578 hired a shipload of people. It's roughly 100 folks, and they went over to establish a colony in the New World that would be the first real effort at an English colony in the New World, and also a base of operations for their privateering ventures. They didn't want to get too close to the Spanish because he had seen from earlier in the century that the Spanish didn't like that. We remember that St. Augustine had been established in modern day Florida in 1565, where there's a military base that the Spanish use to knock off any other Europeans who get too close. So he doesn't want to get too close to that, and therefore he established his base, and the colony he set up was much farther up the Atlantic coast in modern day Canada. He established a colony in what he called, and what we still call, Nova Scotia. And if you've been there, it's a beautiful summer vacation place. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous area. Very cold, of course, right now, but very lovely. Nova Scotia may never occurred to you to wonder why it's called that, but in classic European colonization style, he named it after where he was from. Nova Scotia is Latin for New Scotland. So he has Scottish background, and therefore he decided to name it after the old home. So this colony was established in 1578, and the colonists quickly realized this was not the most auspicious place for a colony. Although it is nice there, and although the winds are bracing and there's those beautiful vistas of the Atlantic Ocean, the soil is not very good for growing things. It's cold, it's rocky. The climate and conditions are not very ripe for growing anything that you might need for food, and it was a forbidding place to set up a colony. And as a result, that Nova Scotia colony, paid for entirely out of the pocket of Humphrey Gilbert, that failed. It didn't even last a year. Survivors basically fled back to England, and Humphrey Gilbert, was out a lot of money. Then later on, Humphrey Gilbert, it's an occupational hazard, Humphrey Gilbert died at sea. Undaunted, Elizabeth turned to her other royal favorite, Walter Raleigh, also a very successful privateer, one of the wealthiest guys in England as a result, and gave him the same responsibility. Transferred the responsibility from his deceased half brother, Humphrey Gilbert, and she turned to Sir Walter Raleigh and said, "Okay, your turn. Find a spot on this map here. That land all belongs to me. Everything along the eastern seaboard, anything north of Florida, is all yours. Find a spot there and set up a colony. It's going to be an English colony. We'll plant the English flag. I'm ultimately responsible as the monarch, but you're going to set up the colony." And again, he said, "Well, how about helping out with paying for it?" And her response was, "Yeah, you're going to set up the colony." So, uh, Walter Raleigh decided to learn the lesson from Nova Scotia and pick a place that was at least warmer. And so he circled an area on the map, roughly the modern day Chesapeake area. That whole area on the map he referred to as Virginia. He is naming that area after his boss, the Virgin Queen. He may know very much that that's not the case, but anyway, that was her nickname. So he's trying to sort of suck up to his boss by naming the area after her. I guess he might have been hoping that she would kick in a few bucks, but no such luck. And then narrow the field a little bit there and establish a colony in 1585 on a little island off the coast of the Chesapeake. It's actually in the modern day state of North Carolina, but the whole area he referred to as Virginia, and so this is going to be the colony of Roanoke. In 1585, again paying for it entirely out of his own pocket because that was his responsibility given to him by the Queen, in 1585, Walter Raleigh sent over a shipload of people to establish an English colony that would be a base of operations for privateering, but other things as well. And this little island, Roanoke Island, off the sort of southern coast of the Chesapeake. Not that far from here. You can certainly drive down and see where it is. There are some interesting ruins, and there's some stuff you can explore down there that's kind of fun. The first year, the colony did not do very well. They'd sent over about 100 people. A lot of them didn't really know what they were doing, and they basically gave up after a year. And unfortunately for him, I guess, Walter Raleigh didn't die at sea. So even though the first year hadn't worked out and he'd lost a lot of money, the Queen encouraged him to try again. So the next year, he sent over another shipload, about another 100 people. And this time he said, let's get it done right. They went to the same place because the initial year they had started the process anyway. That second year in 1586 also didn't work out. Unfortunately for him, most of the people he hired were more serious people than the previous year, but they also were more interested in using the colony to attack the Spanish than they were in setting up a colony. So they didn't do very much of the colony making stuff, and instead they launched an expedition to attack Spanish vessels, which didn't really get anywhere. And in the end, they abandoned the colony as well. So he's now 0 for 2, and again out of a lot of money. But he's still alive. He's still got some cash, and the Queen is still pushing him to make something happen. So 1587, he tried again. Again, a shipload of people were sent over to Roanoke Island, in the place where the 2 previous years they had begun the process of colony making. And this time, I like to think that he had done a better job in the vetting process. Maybe his interviewing had been a little bit more specific, other than, are you willing to get on a ship and go across the ocean? Because in 1587, the group of people that he brought over seemed much more serious. They began to do the stuff that the previous 2 years the early colonists should have done but hadn't done, such as they built fortifications because by now the local Native American tribes are recognizing that there's a pattern here and that these guys are showing up and they seem like they're here to stay, which means, of course, conflict over land because the white guys showing up are encroaching on land that's not theirs. The new colonists also began to figure out about growing food as opposed to just taking food from the local Native Americans, which is another reason why the earlier groups didn't work out. And they sent back for reinforcements. They sent the ship that dropped them off, they sent back to England with message for their boss, Walter Raleigh, back in England. Here's what we're going to need to make this colony work. They're looking for reinforcements, they're looking for more supplies, they're looking for a promise of regular support. However, no ship returned to Roanoke Island for 3 years. Now, that doesn't necessarily speak to the poor quality of navigation and shipping and commerce in those early days, although you could infer that. Actually, it's because that things in the meantime had gotten really bad between the English and the Spanish. The Spanish, as I said, had been shooing off these flies, these mosquitoes that kept attacking their vessels, but were getting more and more irritated, and by 1588 were ready to do something about it. And so in 1588, the Spanish had put together a huge invasion fleet. A big naval invasion was planned, and the idea is that they're going to sail this invasion fleet, this armada, as it was called, across into England, attack England, basically take over, and then they were going to just force the English to listen to them, to be subservient to them. And the Spanish have a lot of money; they can afford a lot of soldiers and a big navy, and this force of ships that they have was huge, and this certainly should have at least partly worked. But the invasion was a failure. There were a bunch of things that went wrong. One, there was a big storm that swept up across the English Channel right as this invasion is happening, which spread a bunch of the ships around and made their invasion much less coordinated, and some of the ships sank. But also, the English put up much greater resistance than the Spanish had predicted. They're imagining England as sort of a rinky-dink, podunk little country, and although that is true, the English do have significant fighting forces and they're a good maritime country. They have, ships that they can use to defend the country with. So the invasion of the Spanish Armada in 1588 was not successful, and instead the English and the Spanish settled into a long-running fight that went on for quite some time, back and forth in the seas and on the mainland of Europe and things like that. So the English and the Spanish are fighting, and this is a pretty big deal. This is an existential crisis for little England, that one of the most powerful countries in Europe is attacking them, and the last thing they have on their mind is, gee, I wonder how things are going over there in Roanoke. Finally, after it was clear that the Armada had failed, and after the sort of a moment in the fighting, elapsed enough for someone in England to realize, yeah, we should check in on those guys. Finally, in 1590, the English did send a ship back to Roanoke to see what was going on. And when this reinforcement ship arrived at Roanoke Island in 1590, they found an abandoned colony. Roanoke had no people left in it. There was nobody. The colony was still there. All the homes were still there. The wells that they had dug, there's still corn growing out in the fields. It doesn't seem like it had been sort of destroyed. It just looks empty. And there's really no clues about what happened to the original Roanoke colonists. There's sort of a weird clue. No one's really sure what this means, but carved into a tree on the outskirts of the colony, there's a message or a word or a what, I don't know, but it says Croatoan, Croatoan, Croatoan. No one really knows what that means or if it means anything. I can tell you this, the colony was abandoned. Our best guess at what happened to the colony is that the initial 100 or so people who had been left behind when that ship went back to England in 1587, their numbers began to dwindle. Illness and other problems, conflict with the local Native American tribes had led to their numbers dwindling, probably problems with food, And as time went on and it became clear to them that they weren't going to be getting any help, that reinforcements were not on the way, either there was some sort of surprise attack on the remaining people that wiped them out, or wiped most of them out, or the survivors went to one of these tribes and said, "Listen, can you take us in? Um, we'll do it. We'll work for you, or whatever." There's some ethnological reason to believe that there was probably some intermarrying between English people and the Native American tribes of the Roanoke area. For example, there in centuries afterwards were blue-eyed Native Americans, which could only have happened if there was some sort of genetic intermixing. Anyway, we don't really know for sure what happened to the Roanoke colony. I can tell you it was a failure. Essentially bankrupted Walter Raleigh, and a lesson that the English learned afterwards is that colony making is expensive. It's a long proposition. It's not something that's going to pay dividends right away. Unlike, say, an attack on a Spanish ship where they've done all the hard work and then you steal it from them at the end, colony making is expensive and therefore not something that you can rely on one individual, rich though he may be, to actually make it work. And so that's a lesson that they're going to learn. In the meantime, their fighting with the Spanish continued and essentially petered out with the death of Queen Elizabeth in 1603. The Spanish leaders really, really hated her, and her death, and then the accession to the throne of the new king in England, James I, provided an opportunity for there to be a break in the action, and ultimately a treaty was signed after James I became king in 1603, where the Spanish and the English agreed to stop fighting. As part of this treaty, this James I got the Spanish to agree that they would allow the English to set up colonies in North America as long as they weren't too close to Spain's control of Florida. In the process, Spain is essentially accepting the fact that they were really never likely to get that much deeper up into North America. They'd given up on any real wealth there. No one had found gold anywhere in that part of North America, so it was okay. And then the English now have permission from the Spanish to set up colonies in an area that they had claimed as theirs for a century plus now, which of course no one's asking the Native Americans who live there already what they think about it, but this is an agreement back in Europe where huge chunks of land are now sort of up for grabs for the English. Now, uh, in the early part of James I's reign, therefore, he began to take more seriously the idea of let's see if we can establish colonies somewhere in this area that we claim as ours, but learn the lesson from the failures of Humphrey Gilbert and Walter Raleigh under his predecessor. The lesson was that no one person can really truly afford the long term sunk costs of paying for establishing a colony. That's something that you need to spread it out. Now, there is an alternative way to raise money for this kind of a project, or really for any kind of big project, which is that instead of having individuals pay for it, you can have investors pay for it. And this is something that's based on an idea that I've been kicking around for a while, but that the Dutch, our friends in the Netherlands, had begun to codify and to develop as a concept. I mentioned the Dutch were a really big deal for a while. In the 1600s, they brought together a whole bunch of interesting economic ideas, one of which was the Dutch put forward the idea of what's called a joint stock company. The idea here is that as the world gets more complicated, as they began to be doing things that were bigger than just stuff you could do in your neighborhood, businesses needed to adapt to that. Previously, most economic stuff just happened locally in your community. And so a business would be just what you did personally, or what your family did, or what you and your brother did, perhaps. You might bring in a partner and have some sort of partnership if it was something more complicated, or if maybe you wanted to make sure that the business continued on after you died. But for the most part, most economic things were small scale and could be done just by one person or by a family. But now, as the age of exploration is opening up a much bigger and much more complicated kind of a world, you have trade, you have the beginning of manufacturing, and all kinds of other possibilities for more complex and more expensive operations. And so the Dutch came up with a way to raise the money for that to make it possible. Rather than have one person or maybe a couple of people run the company, share in the profits, and also share in the risk, instead, what the Dutch came up with was something called a joint stock company. The idea here is that um, a bunch of investors get permission from the government to establish a particular economic entity, and then they sell part of their company to investors who are then going to give them money to do whatever it is that they want to do. So if you wanted to say, I don't know, start a video conferencing company, everybody's on Zoom now, thanks to our social isolation. If you wanted to get into that now, or even better, to get into it a few years ago and get all the kinks out, you probably don't have millions or even hundreds of millions of dollars necessary to set up the infrastructure. Instead, what you do is you sell to investors the idea that you can make a profit on this. Those investors, each give you a little bit of their money. You use all that money, put it all together, and then you use that for whatever your business is going to be. And then that share of the company that those investors have bought, that is a promise that they will get to share in the profits. So if you sold 100 shares or 100 pieces of stock to investors for $1 each, and then you have $100 to spend on whatever your thing is going to be, and then at the end of the year you've earned $110 worth of profit, then that extra $10 will be shared among those 100 investors. They each get a dime, or $1,000, or $10,000, or whatever it turns out to be. And the great thing about it is that if you need more money, if you need to raise more capital, you can sell more shares of your company. You can divide up basically more of your company and sell that to more investors. And that way you can, as long as there's investors willing to invest in your company, as long as you can find people who think that your ideas make sense or that they might be profitable in the future, then you can keep capitalizing your ideas and, in theory, eventually begin to earn a profit. We can do that later on if you need to do something later. Ford Motor Company, if they want to later build a Ford automobile plant somewhere, they can sell to investors shares in the company to raise the money to then build that plant or whatever. The beautiful thing about this from an economic point of view is that it means that the risk is not all in one place. Humphrey Gilbert and Walter Raleigh, when they set up colonies, they lost all that money because they never made any profit out of it. They went out completely. But when you're selling a share of a company to investors, each of those investors is only out their initial relatively small risk. They may have spent $1, $10, even $100 on one share, 10 shares, or whatever in the company. But as long as they're not dumb about their investments, then they have taken money that otherwise they might have put into some other kind of thing, and they've given you a little piece of what they have and hope for future profits coming from that. But if your company fails, then they're out there small. Each of them is out there small risk. Overall, this takes a very expensive proposition and shares across many people the cost of it and the risk of it, as well as the possible profits. So that's the idea. That's the idea of any kind of corporation or a big company that you've heard of. Um, some of them started out run by a small family or whatever, but eventually they began to go public, which means they started to sell shares of their company to investors as a way to raise money. Now, what the Dutch and the English eventually started to do was they weren't satisfied. These investors were not satisfied that they were going to get these profits down the line, that if the company is profitable, that they would get their share of the profits. Instead, Dutch and eventually English and eventually the whole world uh, began to sell those shares back and forth to other investors, essentially gambling on their knowledge of the future success of the company or their knowledge of this may be as much as this is ever going to be worth or whatever. This is the stock market where shares of companies are traded back and forth based on what the current value is, based on what the future value of it might be, based on whether profits look like they're going to go up or going to go down. It is all really just gambling. And our current stock market collapse is an indication that you should not always assume that you're always going to succeed if one is buying shares of stock. But that's why there's so much panic right now on Wall Street, because until this bottoms out and the economy gets humming again, the stock market, which is predicated on understanding risk and then evaluating that, the kind of gambling that goes on there, nobody really knows for sure. And the panic and the low costs of these stocks and so forth has long term consequences. Well, that's a problem for today. Back in the 1600s, this idea of a joint stock company provided an opportunity for the kind of colony making that they had tried previously, but only with one person. And so in 1607, James I allowed for the creation of two joint stock companies with the mission of setting up colonies in the New World. One of them is based out of Plymouth. Plymouth is an important port city in England where ships sail in and out of all the time, and so that makes sense as a location for one. And the other one is based out of London. And each of these two companies sold shares of their companies to investors to raise the money to establish colonies in the New World. And again, they would be theoretically under the English king, and they'll be planting the English flag there. But these companies are responsible for making the some sort of economic success out of these colonies. The Plymouth Company was given the right by James I to establish colonies roughly from modern day Maine down to about modern day New York. The London Company was given the right to establish colonies roughly from modern day Connecticut on down to modern day South Carolina. Now, if you look at a map, it'll quickly be clear, if you didn't get it already, that James I seems to be kind of bad at geography, because he's given these two companies the rights to establish colonies in parts of the eastern seaboard that overlapped. And it seems kind of odd. So, what's going on there? The reality is, this is why James I encouraged the creation of two colony companies, two joint stock companies to establish colonies, to create competition. Competition creates incentives. And in this case, the incentive is whichever one of the two companies was successful first and had succeeded in establishing a colony as a going concern would get to keep that overlap area. That overlap area is roughly New York, the Hudson Bay area. The Dutch aren't there yet. They had begun exploring there, but they hadn't established their colony there. It was clear to a lot of people, though, that this was going to be a pretty good territory, and therefore there's an incentive. Whichever one of you guys gets out the gate first and succeeds, you get to keep that stuff in the middle. So, as it turns out, the Plymouth Company did make the first shot at it. In early 1607, they put together a shipload of colonists, and they established a settlement in modern-day Maine at the mouth of the Kennebec River. Similar to the Nova Scotia colony of a generation earlier, the Maine colony established by the Plymouth Company in early 1607 was not a success. It really wasn't viable for them to establish a colony right from the get-go in Maine, which, like Nova Scotia, is beautiful and a great place to go on summer vacations. And of course, plenty of people live there today, but it's a tough place to grow food. It's a tough place to scratch out a living when they were just getting started. And the Plymouth Company's colony in modern-day Maine failed and therefore was abandoned, leaving it open for the London Company to establish a colony. They had enough time to give this a go. Later in 1607, the London Company sent over their own shipload of people a little farther south and set up a colony not too far from where the old Roanoke colony had been. Again, on the map that had been drawn previously by Walter Raleigh and others, that whole area, basically the whole Chesapeake, had been called Virginia, named after the now dead queen. And so that whole area was referred to as Virginia. The specific colony that the London Company set up in the fall of 1607 was in the southern part of what on the maps they called Virginia, and this is in the current state of Virginia. There was a river that seemed like it was going to be a good navigable river that went into the interior. deep and wide, which is what you're looking for your ships. They named that river after the king, the James River, still has that name today. And then they established at the mouth of the river, right where the river sort of empties out into the Chesapeake, the London Company decided to establish their colony there, and they named that Jamestown. Both those things named after the king who had given them permission to establish this colony. They're sucking up to the king, similar to how Walter Raleigh sucked up to the queen. Didn't really help them particularly much. It's not like the king is going to give them any extra money because he's just as cheap as his predecessor. But the Jamestown colony in Southern Virginia is going to be a much bigger deal than these other ones because although it will struggle, and boy did it struggle, it does continue and is therefore the longest lasting English colony, and is going to be the beginning of successful English colonization in the New World, although it certainly had its struggles. Now, they had chosen this place at the tip of this peninsula here, where the James River um, empties into the Chesapeake Bay, because it seemed like it made sense to them for a lot of reasons. Of course, you want to be near water. Settlements near water always make sense in those days, and really they make sense in all days because water is an important natural resource you need to live. Being near the bay and the river also meant navigation was possible. Being near the water, they felt they would always have food because if nothing else, there is fish available. And they knew that there were other things that grew or that could be hunted in the area, and therefore this seemed to them like a good logical place. Now, they didn't account for the fact that the water actually is not very good to drink. When they tried to dig wells and drink from the well water, a lot of that water was quite brackish and made them sick. And as it turns out, this is the beginning of a problem that not just Jamestown, but most of the early English colonies ran into. The early years of most of these English colonies, there was disease, there was a struggle to feed themselves, and inevitably, like clockwork, the first years of just about every colony the English established, they referred to afterwards as the starving time, because trying to start a colony in a place where you don't know the geography, where you don't know the agriculture, where you're trying to get comfortable with the people around you, um, where you have a lot of work to do just to get started, is enormously difficult, and inevitably the English planned very poorly and wound up literally starving to death in some cases. Uh, about 100 people arrived in Jamestown in the fall of 1607 to try to get their colony started, and by the next spring, roughly a third of them had survived. The starving time is no joke. These people are literally starving to death. They're just barely making it. As they get deeper into 1608, and as the company, which still has investors, as the company sent reinforcements to help the survivors of the initial year continue to make some sort of an effort, and how they're going to make money is still unclear, but they're trying just to scrape out the very basics. Um, it would have helped if the colony business had sent over from London people who actually knew about setting up a colony. It would have made starving time a little bit easier if, for example, they had sent farmers or people who knew something more about building stuff. Um, Today, we all watch Survivor, and you know what you do. The first episode of Survivor, they figure out where they're going to get water from, they figure out where they're going to get food from. Um, they didn't have access to that information. It's good to know reality shows are good for something. And a lot of the first round of settlers didn't have any practical experience anyway. In fact, among that first shipload, the one in 1607, the London Company sent a couple of jewelers. They sent a goldsmith, people who might have been useful if it turned out that somewhere in the Jamestown area there was a gold mine or some other precious metals, but whose skills are not going to be particularly valuable when your job is let's build a fort, let's build settlements, let's grow food, let's begin to scrape out some sort of a living. It's not surprising that they had a starving time. But the reinforcements arrived in the summer of 1608, and maybe they learned their lesson, except they really hadn't learned their lesson. They still spend most of their time exploring around, looking for what they hope would be a get rich quick kind of jackpot, as opposed to doing the grueling, difficult, but necessary work of scratching out a living and building a colony that's there to stay. And as they got started to get closer to the end of the summer and the harvest is coming, they realized they weren't going to have enough food for everybody to get through the winter. Then, to make matters worse, the governor of the colony, the head of the counselors who'd been appointed by the company back in England, it turned out the governor was hiding food somewhere out in the woods. He got caught with that, and although you can understand why he is worried that he and his family are going to starve to death, this is not the kind of leadership that you're looking for in a crisis. It turns out that crises where there's poor leadership happen throughout history. Sometimes there's crises with good leadership, but I look forward to seeing that again someday. But in this case, very poor leadership, and therefore the people in the Jamestown colony, they just fired him on the spot once they realized that he was hiding food for himself. And they put in charge a guy who had been there from the beginning, a guy named John Smith. So John Smith took over the colony in the fall of 1608 and essentially saved the colony. Not that he really got thanked for that. John Smith was an interesting guy. He's a very boring name, but not a boring guy. He's in his 30s at this point, which is a pretty mature guy. He had lived quite a life of adventure. He was a soldier of fortune. He had traveled around Europe and had hired himself out to anybody who was willing to pay for him. He's good with a gun and not shy to use it. And Europe in those days, and really until fairly recently, not my lifetime, but not too long ago, Europe was a place where, because there's so many different countries, it's inevitable that somebody is fighting somebody else. And so, if you want to hire yourself out and find somebody who's willing to pay for you, there's always a war going on, or always the threat of a war going on, which means that everywhere in Europe for centuries, if you want to fight, you can find someone who will pay you to fight. And that was John Smith. John Smith had traveled around Europe and had been involved in one scrape after another, and not a nice guy, had, done all kinds of things that he probably wouldn't want to tell you about. But he had survived them and had put a little money aside as a result of all the payments that he had received. And then when he came back to England in the early 1600s, um, around the same time that the colony companies are getting started up, he became an investor in the London Company, and he was the only one of the investors who was actually willing to go. All the other investors stayed back in England and hoped that the company would make profits for them. John Smith is not that sort of a guy. He dove in head first. And he had been, the previous year, 1607, when they just got started, he had been on that ship that sailed across from London to Jamestown to establish the colony. They refer to him as Captain John Smith. He's not in charge of the ship. That's actually a military title and kind of an honorary title. And he had been appointed as one of the counselors, one of the people who were supposed to help the governor run this colony on behalf of the company back in England. But the whole way over, on the initial ship ride coming over to Jamestown, he had bothered them so much because he has lots of practical questions. What should we do first? I think when we get there, the first thing we should do is we should, like lay out the where we're going to have a fort, and then we can start building that. Although, what about water? What are we going to do about drinking water? And have we thought about what kind of food will grow there? Do we have enough food? Have we counted that up? And what happens if we can't grow enough food? He has all these questions, and they're good practical questions, but they were annoying questions because the other leaders of the colony effort don't have answers to them. And he just kept getting in their face all the time. And finally, he was just so annoying that there was a secret vote among the other leaders whether or not they were just going to throw him overboard because he just annoyed them so much. But in the end, they decided that they would let him not get thrown overboard because he is good with a gun and they might indeed need a gun. John Smith, that first winter, had sort of helped them survive. So during the first starving time winter, as things got pretty bad, as they got low on food, he and a few other men who could still walk took the guns that they had and went to a nearby Native American settlement and basically at gunpoint took some of their food, which is not cool at all, but it did help them survive. But then later, again in that first winter, later when things got bad again, he tried the same trick and this time went to try to steal food from a more powerful tribe. This tribe, which is the most important tribe in this region, led by a chief named Powhatan. For some reason, the English got very confused and thought Powhatan was the name of the tribe as well as the name of the leader. And so that is the name that we still use for the tribe, even though I'm sure it had a different name. But Powhatan's tribe was more powerful. And by this point, John Smith and his men, starving to death, tried to basically blundered into the Powhatan community to try to steal food and were overpowered, were brought forth before Powhatan, these sort of meek, starving men, these white guys from overseas who had so far just completely been bumblers. Powhatan should have probably just executed them, and that is, it appears, what all of his advisors are telling him to do, but he thought they're kind of pathetic. So he decided to let them go. He didn't really think that they were going to make anything of themselves or be a danger to him. But he also wanted to make sure they got the message not to try this again. So even the problem, of course, is that they don't speak the same language, and Powhatan and his tribe have to get through to John Smith and these other English colonists. Don't try something as stupid as this again. So what they try to do is humiliate them to make sure that John Smith and the other English colonists knew that this had been a disaster and that the tribesmen thought of them as puny, weak individuals. So what they did was they set up something kind of like a pantomime, so that Smith would get the message. So Smith and the other English attackers of the Powhatan tribe were brought forth before Chief Powhatan. He is sitting there with his other counselors, looking very fierce. He's yelling at them. He's making threatening gestures. He's making clear that they're miserable and that they should be destroyed. And then, at the last second, Powhatan's daughter, young teenager named Pocahontas, she threw herself on the ground in front of her father, and clearly is pleading for mercy. And after Pocahontas's intervention, then the Powhatan decided to let John Smith and his men go away. Afterwards, John Smith had gone back and had told everybody and told everyone in the books that he wrote later that Pocahontas felt sorry for him, that he had sort of stirred her heart, and that this is going to be the reason why she was able to persuade her father into letting him go free, which means he didn't get the message, because what was supposed to be the message he was going to get is that the Powhatan was going to kill John Smith and the rest of these English people, but a girl saved his life. But a girl, a weak young teenage girl, that she stood up for him, and he should have been humiliated. He should have felt that he was a miserable speck. He didn't get the message. He thought that, I don't know. He thought that she thought he was cute or something like that. And of course, you've probably seen the Disney movie and seen their version of the story. Walt Disney is great for a lot of things, but it's not really something you want to rely upon for historical accuracy. We'll leave it at that. So John Smith had gone back, and they'd survived. A few people had survived that first winter. Now the governor was hoarding food, and the survivors looked to him for leadership because they're desperate. None of them like him very much, but he's there. So John Smith took over the colony in 1608 and helped them get through another starving time winter, this time with much more success. About 200 colonists are in Jamestown as they get to the fall of 1608. As they get to the spring of 1609, only a dozen of them had died, which sounds terrible. Don't want to think about those percentages, but compared to the previous year, not so bad. It appears that he really has pulled their fat out of the fire, because he managed the colony very differently during the period that he was in charge. He has a military background, and he took no questions. He ran the colony essentially like a dictator. He controlled access to food and divided all the colonists up into work groups and gave each of those groups a responsibility for the day. Your job is to do X task, whether it's related to food growing or food gathering or hunting or building more things in the colony. Each one of those groups had to show that they had succeeded in the task that they had been given, and then they would be given the food that they would get for the following day. His basic rule of running the colony was he who does not work does not eat. And although that means that a bunch of colonists, some of whom are goldsmiths and jewelers and don't have any kind of real practical skills. They had to learn quickly because they wanted to eat. And his regimentation and discipline was successful in getting them through that harsh winter. So they should have hailed him as a hero because he'd essentially saved their colony and forced them to do things that were necessary to survive. But he's also forcing them to do things that they didn't like to do. And so the colonists really resented him. They sent a message back to England letting the leaders of the London Company know that John Smith was in charge of the company, or was in charge of the colony now. They knew that the investors back in England would be freaked out by this because none of them back in England thought very highly of John Smith either. That uneducated military dude is running our colony and he's going to ruin our investment. And so, not surprisingly, the company sent a new governor picked by them later in 1609 to take over. John Smith, in theory, should have been able to kind of see this coming or fight it off, but in the summer of 1609, he somehow accidentally lit himself on fire, which is really true, and spent a few months in his tent recuperating from his injuries, which were serious. And when he came out, he was ready to get things going again with the same kind of discipline and regimentation. And instead, the new governor had arrived. All the other guys in the colony looked at him and said, "Yeah, we don't want you anymore. We want this guy." And John Smith got on a ship and left. And he basically left thinking, "Well, you're all going to starve to death. You're doomed without me." And he was right. He later wrote a book about his adventures, explored around some of the New England coast, and that book was later read by not only other people in England, but especially by the Puritans, and will give them some ideas about what not to do in setting up a colony and also where one might set up a colony somewhere else in the English area that they thought they controlled. So, without John Smith in 1609 and into 1610, things got really bad. There had been reinforcements that had arrived, and so they have about 500 people in the Jamestown colony in that third winter. Of them, 60 survived the winter of 1609 to 1610, the worst of the starving time. Things get so bad in the Jamestown colony, they're out of food very early. They are desperate for anything that can give them any nutrition. They ate all the rats and mice and snakes that they could find. Some of them are gnawing on shoe leather or belts because they're made out of cows and they might have some sort of protein or some kind of some nutritional value. And there were not one but two instances of cannibalism in the Jamestown colony during that harshest winter of 1609 to 1610. Um, However, despite the harshness and difficulty of Jamestown's just barely teetering on the edge of completely falling apart, I mean, they're eating each other for crying out loud. Nevertheless, there still is a company back in England that is still able to sell more shares of stock and raise money from investors to continue this effort. And finally, they began to figure out a way they can make a profit on this investment because even though they learned some lessons too about what food to grow and how to manage the colony better, but finally, beginning in 1611, another colonist named John Rolfe helped them figure out a way to make money off of this colony. Rolfe knew that Europeans had been fascinated by and begun to be addicted to tobacco, which was something that we mentioned Columbus had brought back after his first voyage when he had encountered it in Cuba. Huge mania for tobacco all over Europe, but it's very difficult to grow tobacco anywhere in Europe. The climate isn't right, the soil isn't right, the conditions just aren't right. So tobacco is something that had to be grown elsewhere. And mostly that was grown by some European colonists in some of the islands in the Caribbean. Well, John Rolfe realized that the climate and soil conditions were good in the Jamestown area for exactly growing tobacco. So 1611, he planted tobacco with some success and shipped some of that back to England. And the London Company said, "Oh, yeah, here we go. This is going to be the thing," because they could sell that tobacco for a profit. And they sent the word back to Jamestown, "Yeah, you should do more of this." And ultimately, Jamestown became a tobacco growing colony. John Rolfe, who is the one who did marry Pocahontas, that really did happen. John Rolfe saved the colony and provided it with an economic impetus. He brought Pocahontas back to England After they were married, she lived there briefly. Then she died of smallpox, one of the many diseases that the Europeans were bringing to Native Americans who had no resistance. I can't say that her life is anywhere near as romantic or wonderful as the Disney movie would have you believe. Um, it's more of a tragedy, really. But her husband, John Rolfe, had saved this English colony, and in the process, begun to alter the relationship with their Native American neighbors. The colony had to figure out where they were going to place their loyalties because there was a lot of different Native American tribes in the area. At first, the Jamestown colony is just one tiny little speck in and among a pretty complex number of Native American tribes who had intervening alliances, and sometimes they fought and sometimes they didn't, and so forth. And so the Jamestown colony had to figure out what they were going to do about that, because if they're friends with or allied with one tribe, then they can rely on that tribe not to attack them. On the other hand, then the enemies of that tribe might attack them. And so playing this diplomatic game was difficult, especially in the early days, because they're very weak. The marriage of John Rolfe and Pocahontas cemented an alliance between, and it's kind of amazing that this even happened given how badly things started out, but an alliance between the Jamestown colony and Powhatan's tribe. Powhatan's tribe clearly was one of the biggest and most powerful tribes in the area, so this made sense for the Jamestown colonists, but it also meant that all Powhatan's enemies would attack them from time to time. Uh, but as tobacco became the thing that the Jamestown colonists are growing and that they're making their money from, ultimately by 1622, Jamestown is shipping 50,000 pounds worth of tobacco back to England, where the London Company can sell it at a nice, tidy profit. Tobacco also meant that the population of Jamestown was going to expand because more people can live there, more people are making money from it, but also because they need enough land to grow lots of tobacco. And so the survivors of the original settlers, and then other people who came after them, as they realized that tobacco was going to be the thing, they began to grow Jamestown farther out from its initial settlement. Initially, it had been a fairly tiny little settlement out on the hook of the peninsula there, but other settlers went farther up the river to establish their own, they hope, very successful big plantations, which is another word for basically a large farm that grows one thing for profit. So some of these settlers are taking more and more land and getting deeper and deeper and choosing tobacco, the cash crop of tobacco, as the main economic linchpin of their colony meant that there would be increased tension with the Native Americans because it's accelerating the process of stepping on and taking land from Native Americans who'd been there for generations, for millennia. And no one's asking any of these Native American peoples whether this is okay with them. This is just something that the colonists are doing because they think that, well, they're there and they could just do it. And so there were long-standing fights that happened between the colonists and whichever Native American tribes land they're encroaching upon. Things got really bad after the death of Powhatan in 1622. Powhatan's brother took over the tribe, seeing the writing on the wall that these colonists were here to stay and were going to keep growing, keep taking more and more land. Powhatan's brother, Okachankano, tried to gather together a group of all the tribes in the area to attack the English and to crush them, essentially. 1622 to about 1625, there's incredible violence on both sides. Lots of people killed, lots of English settlers killed, lots of Native Americans killed. In the end, the company in England was able to send over enough reinforcements, including people with guns and some soldiers, that the Jamestown settlers were able to defeat the tribes in the Jamestown area. And from that point on, we're going to continue to grow without anybody stopping them for the near future. This was so expensive, though, that it essentially bankrupted the company after whatever that is, 17 years, 15 years, 18. I can do the math. After almost 2 decades, the company had some economic successes, but this very expensive effort to fight this war against the Powhatan tribe and their allies had finally just broken the bank, and so the company went under. At which point, though, then the king took over the colony and managed the colony himself, sending over governors of his own choosing, who picked up where the company had left off. And from that point on, after the local Native American tribes had been defeated, the Jamestown colony spread could continue, and it could continue to make money to generate wealth by growing tobacco, which there seemed to be an unending thirst for, an unquenchable desire for in England and all over Europe. So, the Jamestown colony, in the decades that followed, spread up the James River and then farther out. Every time they went a little bit farther, they, of course, encroached on the land of other Native Americans. Tobacco and then generally the English thirst for more land, led to conflicts at all times with Native Americans whose land they were on. In that story, there is always going to be some sort of conflict, but inevitably, as it turned out, every time that we tell the story, the Native Americans wound up losing more and more land as more and more white people from England started showing up and taking their land. Unfortunately for them, and in the overall balance of power in the colonies, fortunately for the English. So, Jamestown, which started out small and miserable and almost collapsed, and you probably wouldn't have been smart to bet on their survival, eventually became a going concern, economically viable, becomes something that the King of England is going to take some pride in and make some money from, and is the beginning of, finally, after over a generation of failures, the beginning of a successful establishment of English colonies in the New World. The Chesapeake region turns out to be a very good place for them economically because tobacco can grow there, which can be sold as a cash crop for a big profit. Eventually, Jamestown will spread to the point where there's going to be other communities farther away from Jamestown with other names and other people in charge. And eventually, what started out as a small little Jamestown colony in 1607 will spread into the colony that will be called Virginia, which will be a pretty big, by the standards of the English colonies, will be a pretty big colony, their most important and initial early success. All right, while we're in the Chesapeake area, it's worth jumping ahead just a little bit to talk about the neighbors of the Jamestown, which will turn into Virginia, of the Virginia colony, which is Maryland, of course, because we live in Maryland. I'm sitting in a basement somewhere in an undisclosed location in Maryland, and our school, although it's not open for business, it is in Rockville, which is in Maryland, and I assume therefore that everybody who goes to Montgomery College is Montgomery County resident and therefore Maryland resident. So it's good to at least quickly go over the beginnings of Maryland as a colony. Started a little bit later. Jamestown, which became Virginia, started in 1607. Maryland started in 1634. At this point, there's a different king of England. His name is Charles I. James eventually died, as monarchs do, and Charles I took over. In England at the time, we're going to hear more about the religious stuff on Tuesday. But in England, religious controversies were very much a big story in the 15 and into the 1600s. And England had become a confirmed Protestant country, which means Christian but not Catholic. And in fact, the Protestants really hate the Catholics. There were some Catholics still in England at a dangerous time because it was illegal to be Catholic. If you're just a regular everyday person and you're a Catholic, then you are really running a risk because you can get thrown into jail and all kinds of terrible things can happen to you. Rich people, as is often the case, can get away with stuff. And so there was a wealthy Catholic family, the Calvert family, that was Catholic, that has stayed Catholic through all these religious changes. Their leader, a guy named George Calvert, who is known as Lord Baltimore or the Earl of Baltimore, their leader in the 1630s was very worried about the long-term effects of this religious controversy in England. He's not worried about himself, but he is a little bit worried about other Catholics in England and what's going to happen to them. So in 1634, he got in touch with the King of England at the time, Charles I, and he made the king an offer. He said, how about I sponsor, my family, my very wealthy family, how about we sponsor the creation of another colony in the Chesapeake? Jamestown in the southern Chesapeake area was growing into what would eventually be Virginia. But in the northern part of the Chesapeake, there seemed like an opportunity for another colony there. The English have that on their map as part of something that they control, but there is no colony there yet. And Lord Baltimore from the Calvert family, George Calvert, he said to the king, "My family can establish a colony there if you allow me to give permission for this to be a place where people can be Catholic." So essentially, the idea is that he's going to establish a colony. He is going to hire the people to set up the colony, but it will be easy to get people to go and to do the work of setting up a colony if it's a place where Catholics know that they will be safe. And so Maryland, named after a previous monarch of England who had been a Catholic monarch, the last Catholic monarch, as it turns out, Maryland was established in 1634 by the Calvert family with this double mission of establishing a new colony for the English, where they will generate wealth and help make England more powerful and so forth, but also as a Catholic haven. As the colony is established, in many ways, it's very similar to Virginia. As Virginia is growing out of Jamestown, they learn some of the early lessons. They have a little bit less of the starving time. They established St. Mary's, and then eventually some of the other towns in the Eastern Shore. Eventually, the town of Baltimore, which was named after the founder, comes a little bit later. But their colony, the Maryland colony, is economically essentially a mirror image of the colony on the other side of the Chesapeake. They grow tobacco, large plantations, conflict with the Native Americans, whose land they are taking, in larger amounts because the tobacco encourages more and more soil use. Tobacco also is rough on the soil, so frequently after a few years, tobacco plantation just doesn't grow as well, especially given what they had for fertilizer in those days. And so that encouraged people to just sort of give up, abandon, and go somewhere else, which leads to more pressure. So Maryland's established in 1634 as a Catholic haven by the Calvert family, led by Lord Baltimore. Nobody from the Calvert family ever goes there, but they are managing it from England, and the king is perfectly happy with this because now he's got another colony. Now there's more wealth. Now there's more tobacco coming. Ultimately, Maryland was so successful economically that by the end of the century, you practically wouldn't know about the Catholic part of the story because so many people from England wound up coming there when it became clear that it was a good place to grow tobacco and possibly a place to make money. That a lot of people they don't really care about the Catholic part of the story, and by the end of the 1600s, there's way more Protestants living in Maryland than Catholics anyway. Although it is still the center of the Catholic Church in North America for centuries, basically until the late 19th century, when other parts of North America become more Catholic in what's then the United States. So Maryland, established as a Catholic haven, becomes a tobacco generating colony, and in other ways, essentially a mirror image of the Jamestown/Virginia colony that was established on the other side of the Chesapeake. I don't have much else to say about Maryland. We'll hear about them again as we get closer to the Civil War, so in the second half of the semester. But it's good to know where you live and where it came from. When we pick up the story in the second lecture of today, to Thursday the 26th, the second lecture, we're going to hear some specific ramifications of the decision to use tobacco as the main economic base of their colony, and especially return to this discussion of slavery as a labor force, and of course, as a terrible cultural and sociological institution. So that's up next. For right now, take a break, go stretch your legs. That's what I'm going to do. And then we'll come back for part 2 of today's lecture. Thanks.